As you surely already know, in 2019 the United Kingdom is set to leave the European Union. This means a lot of things, but one of the most major impacts of Brexit is how it affects the movement of goods and people. While the UK remains in the EU, freedom of movement is granted by the European single market, which allows goods, services, capital and people to flow freely between EU nations including the UK. This means that if you wanted to sell goods to France from the UK, then they could be shipped across borders without the need for any customs checks. When the UK leaves the EU, depending on the deal negotiated, this could all go away. This makes things harder as new trade agreements would need to be brought in to deal with the changes. The bottom line is that there'll likely need to be stronger borders and controls between the EU and the UK. When people think about the UK, they often picture the British Isles, which is made up of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Needing firmer borders is obviously an issue within the British Isles. Northern Ireland neighbours Ireland, a member of the EU, so the borders between these nations will need to be looked at post-Brexit, and there could be major impacts for the communities and trade that happens there. For more about this issue, you can check out the video we made on Northern Ireland post-Brexit. There's a link in the description. But to think of the UK as just the British Isles is to majorly oversimplify things. As a result of the British Empire, the UK has a number of overseas territories. In fact, there are 14 overseas territories scattered across the globe. Most of these will be reasonably unaffected by Brexit, as 12 of them are islands and 13 of them don't border the EU. This leaves one obvious exception. On the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, you'll find Gibraltar. While Gibraltar is a British overseas territory and Gibraltarians are British, Gibraltar is bordered by Spain. Gibraltarians run their own affairs and the territory is self-governing in all areas excluding defence and foreign policy. And defence is an important factor in Gibraltar, with the territory being very strategically important for the UK. It sits at the entrance of the Mediterranean, giving the British some control over the waters in the region. And it's also only 12 miles from Africa. As such, the UK has a fairly major presence in Gibraltar, including an army base with a port and airstrip. Gibraltar is very important to the UK for a variety of reasons, but its border with Spain means that it will suffer from many of the same difficulties that will be experienced between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Once Britain leaves the EU, unless arrangements are reached, moving goods and people between Gibraltar and Spain could become more complicated, resulting in cumbersome custom checks. This is something which could make life a lot harder for Gibraltarians. It's also something they clearly didn't want to happen. Back in 2016, 52% of Brits voted to leave the EU. When you break it down by nations, you can see that England and Wales primarily voted to leave, while the majority of those living in Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. The difference isn't major, but you can see how each nation differed in their votes. Gibraltarians, however, voted very differently from the other nations. A landslide 96% of Gibraltarians voted to remain in the EU, and with their close proximity to Spain and the rest of the EU, it's easy to see why. Things are made especially complicated due to the history of Gibraltar. There's been an ongoing dispute between the UK and Spain over which nation should control Gibraltar. Spain formally ceded Gibraltar in 1713 with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht. However, since then, the Spanish have tried to reclaim the territory in 1727 and between 1779 and 1783. To this day, some still claim that Gibraltar should be part of Spain, and there are many Spanish people who want to see Gibraltar brought back into the Kingdom of Spain. Despite this, Gibraltarians generally don't want to see Gibraltar return to Spain. A referendum which took place in 2002 saw 98.97% of Gibraltarians vote against a proposal, which would have seen the UK and Spain sharing sovereignty over the territory. As a result, Gibraltar continues to be the territory of the UK, but as discussed, is self-governing in most areas. However, the Spanish claim over Gibraltar resulted in the EU granting Spain special controls in the Brexit process. Core Principle 22 within the withdrawal guidelines gives Spain veto power over whether any agreements reached between the UK and EU also apply to Gibraltar. This means that even if the UK does reach an agreement with the EU, this agreement doesn't automatically apply to Gibraltar, unless the UK and Spain both explicitly agree that it does. This could result in a situation where the rest of the UK has an agreement with the EU allowing free trade and free movement, but that not applying to Gibraltar due to a Spanish veto. If Gibraltar leaves the single market after Brexit, and if Spain chose to put in place burdens and border controls, this could cause major issues for the small territory. A large percentage of Gibraltar's economy comes from its online gambling, offshore banking, and duty-free shopping industries. If Gibraltar were to leave the EU single market, then its ability to trade with the EU would be seriously damaged, and these key industries would all be affected. Any changes to the border and movement of people could also have a big impact on Gibraltar. Every day around 13,000 people move between Spain and Gibraltar for work, including 8,000 Spaniards coming to Gibraltar to work in the Gibraltar economy. Gibraltar also relies on Spain for goods, with all of Gibraltar's construction materials coming from Spain. This means that Gibraltar spends €500 million on Spanish goods every year, so it's safe to say that the two countries are very reliant on each other. This leads to speculation that all of the changes associated with Brexit will mean that Gibraltar is one step closer to becoming part of Spain again. Some say that Gibraltarians could be better off with Spain, as it would renew their access to the EU markets. However, Gibraltar's Chief Minister Fabian Picardo says that this will not be the case. He remarked that Gibraltar will never pay a sovereignty price for access to a market. Gibraltar will never be Spanish in whole, in part, or at all. It's possible that the relationship between the EU and Gibraltar will be subject to its own special terms. Gibraltar could be given access to the customs union and single market by special protocol, meaning that even if the UK didn't have such an arrangement, Gibraltar could still maintain its close ties with the EU. And this has happened before, for example the French territories in the Caribbean who have special relationships with the EU. This could result in Gibraltar remaining a British overseas territory, but being treated like one of the other EU microstates, such as Monaco, San Marino, the Vatican City and Andorra. But getting a deal which involves Gibraltar, or any special deal for the territory, will require a lot of cooperation between the UK and EU, especially considering Spain's veto powers. When Brexit already looks difficult, this adds another layer of complication and could leave Gibraltar as an unwilling bargaining chip to be used between both parties in the negotiation process. What will happen in the negotiations regarding Brexit deals, British borders and Gibraltar is all still very up in the air. However, if you want to be kept up to date with all of the details, make sure to subscribe to TLDR News on YouTube and take a look at some of our other videos in the Explaining Brexit series.